p.m. Eastern from Discord. If you're on Twitch, just type in Discord into chat and you'll get a link to the voice conversation. You're more than welcome to join. We encourage everyone to chime in with opinions, comments, questions, disagreements at any point, or insults. We'll read a portion of the scripture. We'll do some commentary or discussion around it, and then we'll move on to the next portion. The Bible studies typically last about 2 hours and are recorded, so if you miss anything, you can go back and rewatch it. With all that being said, Naz, do you want to give a recap of the last week and just kind of like, I guess, the going into Leviticus?
Sure. So we had the inauguration of the priests in Leviticus chapter 9, and that led on to the scene that we've got with Nadab and Abihu, and they died. And we noted parallels with the Adam and Eve story in Genesis chapter 3. And then we spoke about the instructions concerning food in Leviticus chapter 11. And we noted how, again, there's parallels in the Hebrew to Genesis chapter 3, which scholarship have noted. And so basically, we're tracking along the imagery of Genesis and how it relates to Leviticus. And the imagery is going to continue on with this parsha, because we're going to be talking about childbirth and issues to do with leprosy, and also other issues. That's a pun. So hopefully that is enough for the intro. Over to you, Austin.
Alrighty. So we're going to jump into Leviticus 12, which might be the shortest chapter in all of Leviticus, which is kind of refreshing. Okay. So we'll get into this and then we'll do the commentary and discussion right after 12. And this is purification after childbirth. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, If a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she will be unclean for 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she will be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation. And she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonements for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. If she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. And that is the end of 12. All right. Any comments or, I don't know, questions, anything around purification after childbirth?
Was the lamb or the doves, was that for a sin offering? Is that what you said?
It says a lamb 1 year old for a burnt offering and a pigeon for a sin offering.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And there's a few different rabbinical materials that I came across as far as like why the sin offering. Some of them seem to suggest that a woman in labor says a lot of things that she should not say. I don't know, Naz, if you've got a better reason as to why a sin offering for that. I didn't see anything that really stood out as being sinful for the childbirthing process as far as Leviticus goes.
Well, it's really to do with the chatat and how to interpret what does the Hebrew mean there. And as far as I understand, it's not always in bad context where you've got to offer up a chatat. So again, we're dealing with English translations, and these things can be rather tricky because it's not necessarily the becoming unclean that's the sin. Some people, for instance, would associate the idea of like uncleanness or sin, although this is not entirely accurate. The problem is if you take that uncleanness into sacred space and you breach sacred space in that uncleanness, that's where the sin is. Having a child is not sinful, right? Because obviously having a child makes one unclean, but it doesn't mean that therefore you're sinful. And so there's a distinction there that's going on there. And so where is the sin coming from? Is it the breach of relationship now that you can't enter into sacred space, and is that why you need a sin offering to re-enter sacred space? Or there's lots of little questions like that unfortunately we don't have full clear-cut answers for. So when it comes to the idea of like faulty, for instance, so if a male child is produced, the woman has to remain outside of sacred space for 40 days. If it's a female, she remains outside of sacred space for 80 days. So you got that kind of a doubling there with a female to a male. And so this number 40 is associated now with women giving birth. And so when people like Philo talk about this particular aspect of the Torah, they associate it with the idea of gestation and a fetus gestating in the womb. And anciently, it was associated with, on the 40th day, that would be when the fetus would be formed enough to have features. And so you can also see this type of thinking in the rabbinic material as well, where they associate, for instance, the 40 days and 40 nights in the flood of Noah with the idea of 40 days in Leviticus chapter 12. And so basically what the rabbinic material says is that the reason why they had 40 days and 40 nights worth of rain is because the people at the time of the flood had corrupted the features that take shape on the 40th day. The fetus's features in the womb. And when Philo is also talking about the flood, he also associates 40 with the flood account. And he also says that the reason why you got 40 days there in the flood account is because it was in reaction to mankind destroying creation. And so because obviously you got man who is created in the womb now, and they take shape after 40 days, he says he again relates that back to the idea of that's why they had a judgment of 40 days of rain. And so what this really attests to is more of like a broader understanding of not only we're going to associate this number 40 with childbirth, but we're going to associate 40 with gestation in the womb as well. And so what's going to be very significant is the next chapter, we've got this imagery of a leper. So we've got childbirth in chapter 12 of Leviticus, and then we're going to talk about leprosy in chapter 13 and 14. And when you look in other places, there is this association between childbirth and leprosy. And you'll see this in accounts like with Miriam. When Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses, Miriam gets judged with a judgment and she gets to become a leper. But when Moses intercedes for Miriam, he cries out, "Do not let her become like one who has been half consumed in the womb of her mother." And so he's associating there the judgment of having leprosy to the idea of being birthed through the womb. So, but the fundamental connection we've already got in the Torah in Leviticus, because we've got the Leviticus chapter 12 dealing with birth, and then it goes on to the imagery of leprosy. So there's some kind of internal connection there. Imagery in the story of Elisha as well with Naaman. So Naaman goes to Elisha because he wants to be healed from leprosy, and Elisha sends him a word, the Jordan 7 times. when he comes out, his flesh is newborn child. So again, in different places, you've got this association between leprosy and birth that's going on. But fundamentally, it happens, the association, it happens in these very chapters. So when you think about the Gospels and you think about 12 is employed, because it's employed in Luke, takes the child and they go to the temple after the days of purification. So that's 40 days. And then there's an offering that's performed, and she selects the poorer offering. And you've got this 40 then being associated with the birth of the Messiah. Well, at the end of the Gospel of Luke, you also have a 40 associated after the resurrection, because he spends 40 days with his disciples before he ascends up. And so if you understand resurrection in terms of birth, you've got this association now between birth and 40 days that happens at various places in the Gospel of Luke. This also happens at his immersion as well as his baptism. So he's immersed, and then he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. So if you solidify in your head this connection between 40 and birth, you can employ it in the Gospels to understand the narrative and what's happening. Because the Messiah, when he goes into the wilderness for 40 days, obviously the wilderness is the place of non-sacred space. It's outside of the camp. And then after 40 days, he's coming back into the community. And so this is analogous to what you see in Leviticus chapter 12 when it comes with the woman. When she bears a male, she's to spend 40 days away from sacred space. And then after 40 days, she can come back into sacred space. So this type of understanding of Leviticus and how it's associated with 40 can impact your reading of Genesis. It can impact your reading of other texts and including the Gospels as well. But those are my comments.
Yep. Any other observations or commentary in here? I know we also were discussing just previous to this the releasing of a bird, Noah releasing a bird, and then also having like this possible tie-in to the bird being part of the sacrifice or the offering that was also required for this as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've got texts like the rabbinic material, like Genesis, Midrash Rabbah, Midrash Rabbah, Genesis, and again, it points to the idea of 40 days and 40 nights. You know, why does it have this number? And they associate it with the gestation of the womb, the fetus in the womb, and so they're associating birth imagery with aspects of judgment in the Genesis there. And Philo does the same thing. And so you've got two different sources now pointing at the Genesis story and associating it with birth. And so when it comes to the idea of Noah sending out birds, again, this could track with the imagery that you see with Leviticus chapter 12, because one of the potential offerings that the woman could offer was birds. So again, you know, it can impact your reading of Genesis if you have a kind of an understanding of this is associated with this, and then we're going to read that back into like Genesis and things like this.
Rome was asking, what's the point of associating numbers? Ask something like this for a tabernacle creation too. Yeah. There's a lot of numerology in scriptures. It's like 3, 7, 40, 70. I think that's another one. But each one represents some larger theme throughout scripture.
Yeah. So in the ancient world, if we're approaching this through Leviticus chapter 12, in the ancient world, 40 was associated with the gestation in the womb. Even like the Greek the Greeks medical establishment understood like that gestation in the womb was associated with this number 40. Philo talks about this. And so whether you got the Jewish sources, but you also got the Greek sources. And so basically there was this kind of general conception of the number 40 being associated with gestation in the womb. So maybe that's factoring in as to why you've got this number 40 employed elsewhere in places like Genesis and things like this. And if you understand 40 being associated with birth, think about of this in terms of the nation of Israel. When they were in Egypt, you could understand that in the context of being birthed. They were coming out of Egypt and they're being birthed. They're going through the waters of birth, so to speak. And then what happens? Are they associated with 40? Well, they are. They go into the wilderness for 40 years. And so again, this type of association can have implications for your reading of other texts within the Torah, outside of the Torah, etc., etc.
Cool. Any other comments, questions on?
What's the significance of the burnt offering?
Unfortunately, we don't know all of the ins and outs, all the intricacies of what these offerings actually meant in the original context. And even the Hebrew words, or what do they actually mean? So burnt offerings is like an ascent offering. So it indicates something that arises up or goes upwards. But it's very, very difficult to nail down precisely what these mean. So the tabernacle itself was associated with all creation. The Jewish sources are pretty explicit about this. So every part of the temple or tabernacle represents a part of creation. And so when you're looking at the tabernacle, you're looking at renewed, restored creation. And so when it comes to the actual offerings, you've got people like Philo, and when they're talking about the offerings, they associate the various different animals to the various different parts of the universe. Again, just like with the temple furniture and other elements of the temple. And so that is potentially one avenue. It's the animals themselves represent creation, which are being offered up to the Most High. But then you've got kind of sub-distinctions in various different types of offerings, like peace offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings and things like this, guilt offerings. But it's very difficult to say with any type of certainty what these things actually meant within their original contexts. And so this is what some of scholarship are trying to figure out currently. How do we understand what these words mean, and what's the function of these offerings? But I don't have a clear-cut answer.
Okay. I'll move on to the next Leviticus 13. These are the laws about leprosy. Yeah. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests. And the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body, and if the hair is diseased area, if his hair in the diseased area has turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a case of leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the white spot in the skin of his body appears no deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, then the priest shall put up the diseased person for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and if his eyes, the disease is checked, and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall shut him up for another 7 days, and the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day, and if the diseased area has faded and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only an eruption. and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the eruption spreads in the skin after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again before the priest. And the priest shall look, and if the eruption is spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous disease. When a man is afflicted with a leprous disease, he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall look, and if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic leprous disease in the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He shall not shut him up, for he is unclean. And if the leprous disease breaks out in the skin, so that the leprous disease covers all of the skin of the diseased person from head to foot, so far as the priest can see, then the priest shall look, and if the leprous disease has covered all of his body, he shall pronounce him clean of the disease. It has turned white, and he is clean. But when the raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean, for it is a leprous disease. But if the raw flesh recovers and turns white again, then he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And if the disease has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce the diseased person clean. He is clean. If there is in the skin of one's body a boil and it heals, and in the place of a boil there comes a white swelling or a reddish white spot, then it shall be shown to the priest, and the priest shall look, and it appears deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of leprous disease that is broken out in a boil. But if the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in it, and it's not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall shut him up for 7 days. And if it spreads in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean, for it is a disease. But if the spot remains in one place and does not spread, it is a scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or when the body has a burn on its skin, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a spot, reddish white or white, the priest shall examine it. And if the hair in the spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, then it is a leprous disease. It has been broken out in the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is the case of a leprous disease. But if the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in the spot, and it's no deeper than the skin, but has faded, the priest shall shut him up for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and if it is spreading in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of a leprous disease. But if the spot remains in one place and does not spread to the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is the scar of the burn. A lot of this stuff is so repetitive. Okay. Much more on this. Wow. Okay. When a man or woman has a disease on the head or the beard, the priest shall examine the disease, and if it appears deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is yellow and thin, then the priest shall not pronounce him unclean. It is an itch, a leprous disease of the head or the beard. And if the priest examines the itching disease, and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall shut up the person with the itching disease for 7 days. And on the 7th day the priest shall examine the disease. If the itch has not spread, and there is no yellow hair, and the itch appears to be no deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself, but the itch he shall not shave, and the priest shall shut up the person with the itching disease for another 7 days. And on the 7th day the priest shall examine the itch, and if the itch has not spread in the skin, and appears to be no deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the itch spreads in the skin after the cleansing, then the priest shall examine him, and if the itch has spread into the skin, the priest need not seek for yellow hair, he is unclean. But if in his eyes the itch is unchanged, and the black hair has grown in it, the itch is healed, and he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. When a woman or a man has spots on the skin of the body, white spots, the priest shall look, and if the spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is leukoderma that has broken out in the skin, and he is clean. And Sunshine Games, welcome to the Bible study. If you have any questions or comments or anything like that, you can just post them in the Twitch chat or type in Discord, and you can join us in the voice conversation. There's quite a few of us here. If a man's hair falls out from his head, he is bald, he is clean. And if a man's hair falls out from his forehead, he has baldness of the forehead, he is clean. But if there is on the bald head or the bald forehead a reddish white diseased area, it is leprous disease breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine him, and if the disease swelling is reddish white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, like the appearance of a leprous disease in the skin of the body, he is a leprous man. He is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean, and his disease is on his head. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover up his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling will be outside the camp. When there is a case of a leprous disease in garment, whether a woolen or linen garment, in warp or woof of linen or wool, or in the skin of anything made of skin, if the disease is greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the skin, or in the warp or the woof of any article made of skin, it is a case of leprous disease, and it shall be shown to the priest. The priest shall examine the disease and shut up that which has the disease for 7 days. He shall examine the disease on the 7th day. If the disease has spread in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in the skin, whatever be the use of the skin, the disease is a persistent leprous disease. It is unclean. He shall burn the garment, or the warp, or the woof, the wool, or the linen, or any article made of skin that is diseased. For is it a persistent leprous disease, it shall be burned in the fire. And if the priest examines, and if the disease had not spread in the garment, in warp or woof, or any article made of skin, the priest shall command that they wash the thing which is the disease, and they shall shut it up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine the diseased thing after it's been washed, and if the appearance of the diseased area has not changed, though the disease is not spread, it is unclean. You shall burn it with fire, whether the rot is on the back or on the front. But if the priest examines, and the disease area has faded after it has been washed, he shall tear it out of the garment, or the skin, or the warp or the woof. And if it appears in the garment again, in the warp or woof, or any article of clothing, or any article made of skin, it is spreading. You shall burn it with fire, whatever has the disease. But the garment, or the warp or woof, or article made of skin from which the disease departs, when you have washed it, shall be washed a second time and be clean. This is the law for the case of leprous disease, and a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or any article made of skin, to determine whether it is clean or unclean. So, if it doesn't spread, and it's not more than skin deep, and it fades after washing, you can call it clean. Okay, comments, questions. There's a lot that went on, but not that much all at the same time.
Okay, so let's think about the imagery here for a moment. So we'll call it leprosy for now. And so when we look elsewhere in the Torah, like in Numbers chapter 12, verse 12, we've got this situation where Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses. And the Most High hears this, and he causes a judgment to befall Miriam, and she becomes leprous. And this is what Moshe says about Miriam. Do not let her be like unto death, like a miscarriage coming out of a mother's womb, and it devours half her flesh. So in that that's from the Septuagint there. But this is from the a Masoretic rendering. I pray, do not let her be as one who is dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed when he comes out of his mother's womb. So when Moses is thinking about this kind of leprosy imagery, he's associating it with a miscarriage, an abortion, someone who's come out of their mother's womb in a half-consumed state, and he associates it further with death. And so when we're thinking about leprosy, and what should we associate it with, these are a couple of things that we should really click to when we're thinking about the type of imagery that's being conveyed here. And so again, you've got this kind of birth connection that's connected to the idea of leprosy. And as we've already seen, this makes sense because we've just had the previous chapter of a woman giving birth. And now in the Torah, the next thing that we get associated, or the next thing in the sequence, is this idea of leprosy. So the Torah there is making this connection between the two. And so that's going to impact your reading of other texts when you're dealing with leprosy and things like this. So when it comes to the imagery of the leper being purified and coming back into the camp, what you're going to see is that the leper is going to have their hair shaved off, and they're going to have blood placed on their right side, on their ear, thumb, and toe. And so, if you really think about that imagery, is it possible that that type of imagery is really conveying a newborn child? Right? They've got no hair. They're bloody because they're coming out of the womb. And so again, is this rebirth imagery that we're actually seeing that's being associated with they were once a leper, but now the leprosy is passing away. Now they can come back into the community. They're not considered to be dead. They're not considered because now they were outside of the community. They were in the wilderness, so to speak, and now they're coming into a sacred space. And so again, do we have these kind of images of rebirth being associated with the purification of the leper coming into the picture? And what's also interesting also is the purification and the imagery of placing the blood on the right side. It mimics the priesthood when they were inaugurated. And so basically, the leper now is cleansed and they're being inaugurated back into the priestly community, because the entire community was meant to act as a nation of priests, according to Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. And so we've got this kind of priestly and birth imagery now merging and coming together. And so those ends my comments for now.
I have a question. So would leprosy, so you brought up like Aaron and his wife going against Moses and God striking his wife with leprosy. So would leprosy be like an example of divine, I don't know if I'd say justice, judgment from God then in the Old Testament? Kind of going back to like Deuteronomy 28, where if the Israelites kept the commands of God, they'd be blessed. But if they didn't, they'd be cursed, and different things would fall upon them, more or less. Would it be something like that, or would it be something that we'd understand, like people just get sick nowadays, like from the flu or maybe, but this example would be more like leprosy, more or less.
Yeah, so Miriam and Aaron, they speak against Moses because Moses takes a wife. And so you within the narrative, you've got this idea of reproach, right? If her father had but spat in her face, she would have been ashamed 7 days. And so you've got this idea of being ashamed. And so this is how the Most High brings about a resolution, or to basically defend the honor of Moses. And so what he does, he causes Miriam to become leprous, and then she has to go outside of the camp. So the entire camp now know, because they have to stay where they are until the 7 days are up. And so everyone knows now that Miriam's outside the camp, and that's the reason why they're stopped. And so you've got this kind of divine retribution, so to speak, or punishment that's coming into the picture. And so it's connected to the idea of how Moses is going to be defended. His honor is going to, because you're dealing with an honor and shame culture in the ancient Near East. And so basically what Miriam and Aaron have done, they have shamed Moses through the way that they're kind of speaking about him. And so what you're seeing is the Most High defending the honor of Moses. And basically, the basic idea is you reap what you sow. And so Miriam is now going to go outside of the camp. She's going to be ashamed for 7 days, and then she's going to re-enter the camp. So this is how the choice that the Most High has made. And this is why some authorities, when they think about leprosy, they associate it with the sin of Lashon Hara, the evil tongue, because Miriam and Aaron were talking against Moses, And so the judgment was, well, okay, you're going to get leprosy, or however you define the Hebrew term. And that's another problem. We don't actually know how to interpret this Hebrew term. Leprosy is not probably the best interpretation of the Hebrew word itself. And so it's tricky. It's pinning down what the Hebrew actually means, and what does this actually relate to in terms of what kind of illness this was, or sickness it was. But hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, I think it kind of does. The second question would be, so if a person had leprosy or some type of issue that caused them to be unclean, would they in essence lose fellowship with God? Or how would that look, I guess?
So in the context of the Torah, you've got these kind of distinctions. So the camp is holy. So the camp is sacred space.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Numbers chapter 5, verse 2, you've got three main categories of impurity. So the three main categories would be, one would be leprosy, one would be if you've come into contact with corpse, it's corpse impurity. And the other one is if you have like an issue, like for instance, like an issue of blood, but there's other issues. So you've got three main categories. And if you fall into one of those three main categories, you would have to go outside of sacred space. So it's not so much that you don't have you lose a divine relationship, so to speak. The problem is that with the direct presence of the Most High within the camp is therefore holy. And so if now you go into sacred space and you breach sacred space in an unclean state, that could end very badly, because there are holy areas that you should never go in an unclean state, because one of the judgments against you, if you do, is death. And that's part of the role of the Levites, to ensure that no one breaches that sacred space or brings uncleanness into sacred space. And so basically, it can also be protective for the individuals involved, because now if they're placed outside of the camp, there is no possibility whatsoever of them breaching sacred space or anything like that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so you got to realize that within the context of the Torah, the death penalty was a very real reality. And so, actions have consequences. And so there is an order to the camp. So like even when you go to war, right, you've got a special priest that goes with the war camp. Some say that this is like the second high priest in the Torah. But basically, you do have an anointed priest in the camp of war. And so in that context also, the camp is holy, even if you're going into war. And so basically any uncleanness has to go outside of the camp. And so it's not necessarily that because you have an uncleanness that therefore you don't have a relationship, because like men have, for instance, in a war camp, they could have like emissions during the night, and that would necessitate them to then leave the sacred space of the war camp. But that doesn't mean that therefore that they don't have a relationship with the Most High. It just means, again, the camp is holy, you're dealing with sacred space, and there's things that you simply don't do in sacred space. And so hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, I think it helps give a better picture to it. So then, sorry, follow-up question. So then, like, I'm thinking through like the example in the New Testament with the woman with the issue of blood. So she wouldn't have been able to enter into the temple area, and so she wouldn't also be able to perform sacrifices. So would she be considered guilty of sin then, in that example, from that perspective? Or
No. We have to make a distinction between uncleanness and sin. Uncleanness doesn't necessarily mean sinfulness. The problem with uncleanness is if you take that uncleanness into sacred space, if you breach sacred space, that's where the sin is. But for instance, like women, they give birth. It's not sinful. But men have emissions.
Sure.
It's not like, for instance, like sexual relations between husband and wife. There's emission there, and that would be classified as uncleanness, which you're going to see in like Leviticus chapter 15. But um, having marital relations is not sinful. Becoming unclean because of having marital relations is not sinful. And so there's a clear distinction between becoming unclean and what you do with that uncleanness. Do
Okay.
you go according to the Torah and do not breach sacred space, or do you take that uncleanness into sacred space? And then that's where the problem is. And this is why you're seeing Leviticus clear warnings: don't bring the uncleanness into sacred space, because that's where bad stuff happens.
Yes, and that helps piece things together a little bit better in my mind.
Cool. Yeah, and going back to the leprous issue as well. When I was doing some digging into that, I think it was something on like Torah.com or something, but basically just saying that the generally agreed on through rabbis modernly, um, that this does not actually occur anymore, at least outwardly, and they haven't observed any cases of this for centuries. And the most popular reason that's accepted, is because there's no temple, and since there's no temple, there's and no priesthood, there's no authority to discern, or perform any kind of cleansing or atoning ritual for this. And so this is previously has been seen as a plague that's caused by God or something that is directly influenced by God. But since there is no way um, to know for sure if this is, what, like, if it is that plague, um, it no longer is cast upon us, so to speak. But that's just uh, the sage reasoning behind why we don't see it today. All right. Now we go into the cleansing for the lepers. Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This." Oh wait, hold on. Did I just do that? No, I didn't. Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look, and if the case of leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command him to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in the earthenware vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood, and the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. He shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease, and then he shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird go into the open field. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, and shave off all of his hair, and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside. He After that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent for 7 days. And on the 7th day he shall shave off all of his hair from his head, his beard, his eyebrows. He shall shave off all of his hair, and he shall wash his clothes, and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, and 1 ewe lamb with a year old without blemish, and a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, and 1 log of oil. And the priest who cleanses him shall set the man who is to be cleansed and these things before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall take one of the male lambs and offer it for a guilt offering along with the log of oil, and wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. And he shall kill the lamb in the place where they kill the sin offering and the burnt offering, in place of the sanctuary. For the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it on the palm of his own left hand, and dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand, and sprinkle some of the oil 7 times before the Lord. And some of the oil that remains in his hand the priest shall put on the lobe of his right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, and on top of the blood of the guilt offering. And the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed. Then the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. The priest shall offer the sin offering to make an atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanliness. And afterwards he shall kill the burnt offering, and the priest shall offer the burnt offering and grain offering on the altar. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be clean. But if he is poor and cannot afford so much, then he shall take 1 male lamb for a guilt offering to be waved, to make atonement for him, and 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, and a log of oil. Also 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, whichever he can afford. That one shall be a sin offering, and the other a burnt offering. And on the 8th day he shall bring them for his cleansing to the priest, to the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. And the priest shall take the lamb of the guilt offering and the log of oil, and the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. And he shall kill the lamb of the guilt offering, and the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall pour into the some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, sprinkle it with his finger, some of the oil that is left 7 times before the Lord. And the priest shall put some of the oil that is in his hand on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, in place where the blood of the guilt offering was put. And the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed, to make atonement for him before the Lord. And he shall offer of the turtle doves or pigeons, whichever he can afford, 1 for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering, along with the grain offering. And the priest shall make atonement before the Lord for him who is to be cleansed. This is the law for him in whom is the case of a leprous disease, who cannot afford the offerings for his cleansing. That's what we got there.
Yeah, if we track along with the imagery of what we saw in Numbers, when Moses is talking about Miriam, he associates Miriam's leprosy with birth imagery, and so we're going to see this also in 2 Kings chapter 5 verse 14 when it comes to the account of Naaman. And so Naaman goes to Elisha to be healed from leprosy, and he goes down to the Jordan as per the words of Elisha, and this happens. Then he went down and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So there the text is thinking about it, it's reporting the details of Naaman's cleansing when he goes into the Jordan, and it associates when he comes up out of the Jordan with his flesh of that of a little child. So again, you've got this kind of birth imagery that's underneath the surface there, that's being associated together. But if we track back to the association there in the Torah from Leviticus chapter 12 to chapter 13, this association would make sense. And so again, what kind of imagery does leprosy convey to a person? It's kind of, it has this associated birth imagery associated with it, and the idea of death, right? Because Moses cries out to the Most High for Miriam not to be like someone who's dead, and so you've got this death and birth imagery that's being associated with leprosy. And so if you track with that imagery with the purification that the leper goes through, their head is going, all of their hair is going to be shaved, so they're going to be like a newborn. They're going to have blood placed onto their right side, on their ear, on their thumb, on their big toe. Again, could that be in reference to the kind of birthing blood that you see. And so basically, it's a ritual rebirthing, so to speak, of the individual. They were outside of the community, outside of the camp. They were considered to be dead. Now they're coming back into the community. They're being rebirthed. And so again, it's also about status as well. They're being reestablished within the community. So their ritual process mimics that of the inauguration of the priesthood. When the priesthood were inaugurated, they also had their right side dabbed with blood as well. And so again, it attests to like aspects of priestly, the nature of the person. Now they're being restored, their status is being restored. And so when you track this imagery with the Gospels, also when the Messiah, when he heals people of leprosy, he's not just simply healing a sickness. He's restoring their standing within the community. He's restoring their social status. And so remember, it's an honor and shame culture. And so basically, he's bringing them honor by reestablishing them back into the community. Whereas before they were outside, they were considered to be dead and in need of a rebirth, so to speak. But those are my comments.
So I was reading through this. Is the blood being sprinkled on the person 7 times to make them clean?
Let's track through this and let's read this.
Saying that, I think it's in verse 6. It says, "He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood, and scarlet yarn and the hyssop, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over fresh water. He shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease." Because usually, like, blood would be associated with uncleanliness. Like, if you have blood on you, then you're unclean. But here, it's like blood is cleansing something.
Well, I don't think I not necessarily. I wouldn't say if you got blood on you, you're unclean. I wouldn't
Right.
necessarily agree with that because we do have there
I
are
guess
texts where you do have this kind of like this bloody image, but they're not considered to be unclean.
I guess this also works with the birth imagery because with the birth, the flood of blood for the 40 days or whatever, that's a cleansing process using blood. And if we're staying more in that idea of this birth imagery and using the same kind of blood to give a rebirth or renew someone, it would also fall kind of in that same line.
Well, here's the thing, right? It's 7 times, right? And he shall sprinkle upon him that is to be cleansed from leprosy 7 times. You know, what's the function of 7 here? Is this a nod to like the creation week? Because we've got the kind of a 7 day structure within the creation week. And so if we're associating leprosy with kind of or the cleansing of a leper with new birth, could the 7 be a nod to like the creation week? And so then this really tracks back to our understanding of cosmology, how we understand the universe, how in biblical terms. And in the biblical material and outside of the biblical material, when it thinks about Genesis chapter 1, it thinks of it in terms of birth. And so the mountains were born, the seas were born, Adam was born. And so now creation and birth are being fused together. And so when you've got this idea of 7, again, it's tracking back to the idea of creation and birth. So this may all be playing into just the greater narrative of new creation, new birth.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Any other comments, questions, insults? If anyone just wants to say hi in voice chat, you're more than welcome to. Then we'll go into the laws for cleansing a house. Oh, and give me just a second. There's a random knocking noise. Okay, I don't know what that was. Alrighty. Cleansing the house. Oh, and this is where I was saying that the leprous disease is seen as something that's coming from God. Is I think it comes from this verse here. Oh, and I'm gonna wait until Piff's done typing, and then we'll move on. Okay, fine. She's not gonna type because I said that. All right, fun, Piff. All right, then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when you come into the land of Canaan, which I gave you for a possession, and I put a case of leprous disease in a house in the land of your possession, then he who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, there seems to be some case of disease in my house. Then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priest goes to examine the disease, lest all that is in the house be declared unclean. And afterwards the priest shall go in and see the house, and if he shall examine the disease, and if the disease is in the walls of the house with greenish or reddish spots, and if it appears to be deeper than the surface, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house and shut up the house for 7 days. And the priest shall come again on the seventh day and look. And if the disease has spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they be take out the stones in which the disease and throw them into an unclean place outside the city. And he shall have the inside of the house scraped all around, and the plaster that they scrape off shall be poured out into an unclean place outside the city. And they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and he shall take other plaster and plaster the house. If the disease breaks out again in the house, after he has taken out all the stones and scraped the house and replastered it, then the priest shall go out and look. And if the disease has spread in the house, it is a persistent leprous disease in the house. It is unclean. And he shall break down the house, its stone, timber, and all the plaster in the house, and he shall carry them out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever enters the house while it is shut up shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever sleeps in that house shall wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house shall wash his clothes. But if the priest comes and looks, and if the disease has not spread in the house, after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, for the disease is healed. And if for the cleansing of the house he shall take 2 small birds, with cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and shall kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water, and shall take the cedar wood, and the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn, along with the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the bird that was killed in the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. Thus he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the fresh water, and with the live bird, and with the cedar wood, and the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. And he shall let the live bird go out of the city into the open country. So he shall make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. This is the law for any case of leprous disease, for an itch, for a leprous disease in a garment or in a house, and for a swelling or an eruption or a spot, to show when it is unclean, and when it is clean. This is the law for leprous disease. And that's the end of 14. Comments, questions, oddities, anything anyone wants to point out, commentary?
So you got this idea of stones being taken away and then being taken to an unclean place. Some have drawn a parallel to what happens in the Gospels when the Messiah is talking about the temple, and he says that one stone shall not be left upon another. And so, is he pointing to the judgment here of Leviticus about the house needed to be basically deconstructed, all the stones taken out, and then placed into the wilderness outside of the camp? But those are my comments.
I think most of the stuff that I commented on about the person would still apply to the house in this case. So yeah.
The disease, the issues with the stones, does it say it's like a disease of leprosy, or was this? I can't remember what you said. Or does
Yeah,
it specify what the issue is? Is it like mold or mildew or something like that?
So as far as the translation is concerned, it's the same word, and I
Okay.
believe it's the same in the Hebrew as well. Naz, correct me if I'm wrong here.
I haven't got the Hebrew text in front of. I would have to,
Yeah, it's I have to pull up with that. Tezarat um, is used in both of them. It's the skin
Okay.
disease and the leprous mold and the leopard person. Um,
yeah, I didn't want to shoot from the hip, but
yep.
so yeah, it's very difficult to define what this word means. You've got different opinions about how to really translate it. What does it actually refer to? And the general consensus is that leprosy is probably not the best word to interpret what on earth it is that it's talking about. Um, so but whatever it is, it can affect even buildings.
And it doesn't seem that it is like so much contagious because if you are like in that house, it's like, oh, okay, well, you'll recover by evening. Like you're just unclean for a short while. It's not like you have to be, looked at after 7 days or anything like that. So it doesn't appear to be like this, like a skin disease that's something where a priest can look at you or touch you and then not contract it. So it has to be a little bit different than leprous or leprosy.
Yeah, I mean, you got the principle of overhang. So for instance, when it comes to like corpse impurity, if someone dies in a room, you've got this principle of overhang where if someone enters into the room, they become unclean. So you got kind of like a parallel there as well. If you enter the room, then you're going to be unclean. Um, and so you've got this principle of overhang also in the book of Acts as well. When Peter is walking about, the people are trying to get into his shadow. Why are they doing that? Or why are they trying to get into his shadow? Why are they trying to allow his shadow to cross over them? Well, it's this principle of overhang where um, just like how uncleanness can be transferred one to another because you're walking into, like, for instance, an area which is rendered unclean by corpse impurity. You've got this principle. It also works in the opposite direction. Uncleanness can flow from one to another, but holiness can be transferred one to another as well. And you can see that in texts like in the Torah and outside the Torah when it comes to like Ezekiel. When Ezekiel's in the latter chapters, when it's talking about the garments of the priests, the garments of the priests have to be stored away safely in sacred area because if they're not, there is a chance that those outside may come into contact with them, and then you get this idea of transference of holiness from one to another. And so basically, uncleanness can be transferred from one to another, but also holiness can be transferred one to another. And so when you're thinking about this in terms of the Gospels and how the Messiah goes around healing people, if you notice, people touch him, right? And you would think, well, okay, you've got unclean people who have got issues and so forth like this, but wouldn't that make the Messiah unclean? Why suddenly are they healed? And what's going on there? Well, you've got this a principle of transference that goes on of holiness. And so when they touch him, basically his holiness um, is transferred onto them. So they're not transferring their uncleanness onto him. They're getting his holiness basically through transference. But the principle of that is actually within the Torah itself, and so it's two ways. So we got
So
a question.
people don't seek someone's shadow because they want to join the dark side, so they get the transferness of holiness.
Yeah, I mean, when you're reading like the Book of Acts, why do the people have this assumption that if they get into Peter's shadow that they can be
Sure.
healed? Why? Well, you've got to really ask the question: why are they thinking like that? What's powering their thought when it comes to that? And you get this idea of transference in the Torah. So we got a question from Realm: does being clean only relate back then? before Jesus died, or do we still need to worry about it since this is only for holy places, and I'm assuming most people don't go to the holy temples? Why worry about being clean?
Well, that's a good question.
So yeah, so when it comes to like temple and like corpse impurity, basically we're all unclean, technically speaking, because if you've come into contact with a corpse, for instance, there's a particular ritual you need to go through. Like for instance, you would need the ashes of the red heifer sprinkled on you to be cleansed from that. But obviously, no one's that is not being done, and so basically, everyone is at technically the highest level of impurity, and so it's very difficult to apply types of what you see in the Torah when it comes to like leprosy and things like that in everyday situations, because the community doesn't have the kind of holiness that you see employed in the Torah. Although, here's the problem: in the Gospels and the Epistles, the community, those who accept the Gospel, they are associated with being holy. And so you still do have aspects of holiness being associated with the community. And so then you have to gauge that. So then how would you understand holiness within that context if there's no standing temple? What would you do with aspects of holiness? Are we not holy today? Are we not considered to be holy, or are we still considered holy? And so when it comes to like the apostle, like Paul and others, they would understand the community acting as the temple. And so within that community, you do have the aspect of holiness associated with it, because now you're taking on ideas of sacred space. And so basically you're an extension of the sacred space that you see in the temple. So in a way, it's us trying to. So yeah, so when you think about the Messiah, so the follow-up question was, so in a way, it's us trying to be Christ-like. So when you think about the Messiah, if you think about him in terms of high priest and temple, because you've got text in like the Gospel of John where he talks about his body being the temple, and also other texts which place him in a high priestly context. That context would also then be extended to you, right? Because he is the temple, then you can also be part of that temple. Because he is the high priest, you have access to being priesthood. And so again, it's outworking from the Messiah into the community. And again, it goes back to the aspect of him elevating the status of those around him, right? Part and parcel of being the Messiah is to elevate the status of those around you. And so this is what you see happening in the Gospels. The Messiah is healing people, he's restoring people their status in the community, and he's restoring their holiness, right? He heals people who've got issues of blood, who are in an unclean state, so he brings them back into the status of being holy. And so again, this type of way of thinking can impact our understanding of what it means to be those who accept the gospel, because you're being now fused into this temple. You're being fused into this priesthood that's emanating from the Messiah, and he's elevating your status because of that. And within that, you've got ideas of holiness and sacredness and things like this, if that makes sense.
So you're saying like we're cleansed, like our method of cleansing is through the blood of Christ. But as far as like we should attempt to be clean, but where we are unclean, it's more purified for us without the use of a temple.
Yeah, I mean, these types of issues, you'll have text like in, I believe it's Chronicles, where the people want to observe the Passover, However, the people weren't cleansed according to the Torah. And so now you've got a contradiction on your hands, because you're not permitted to eat the Passover unless you're in a cleansed state. And so what happens is a prayer is given that the people are permitted to eat the Passover even though they're not cleansed according to what the Torah says. And so they're eating something that which is holy, but in an unholy state, yet the Most High permits it. And so this type way of thinking is permissible. It is possible, at least within the Tanakh. If you give me a few moments, I'll get the text and I'll come back.
Yep. We can move on to the next part while you're looking it up. And this is the last part of the Torah portion, which is laws about bodily discharges. Super fun. Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. And this is the law of his uncleanliness for a discharge, whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is blocked up by his discharge, it is uncleanliness. Every bed on which the one with the discharge lies shall be unclean, and everything on which he sits shall be unclean. And anyone who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. And whoever sits on anything on which the one with discharge is sat shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean till evening. And whoever touches the body of the one with discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until evening. And if the one with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, then he shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until evening. And any saddle on which the one with the discharge rides shall be unclean, and whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until evening. And anyone who carries such things shall wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and be clean until the evening. Unclean until evening. Anyone whom the one with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean till evening. And an earthenware vessel that the one with the discharge touches shall be broken, and every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water. And when the one with the discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, and wash his clothes, and he shall bathe his body in fresh water, and shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and come before the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. And the priest shall use them, one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord for his discharge. If a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water, and be unclean till evening. And every garment and every skin on which semen comes shall be washed with water, and be unclean until the evening. If a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them shall bathe themselves in water, and be unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge is in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. And everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean till evening. And whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until evening, whether it is the bed or anything on which she sits. When she touches it, she shall be unclean until evening. And if any man lies with her, and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge shall continue in uncleanliness. As in the days of her impurity shall she be unclean. Every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanliness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, bring them to the priest, to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the priest shall use one for a sin offering, the other for a burnt offering. and the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for her unclean discharge. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanliness, lest they die in their uncleanliness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. This is the law for him who has a discharge, and for him who has an emission of semen, becoming unclean thereby. Also for her who is unwell with her menstrual impurity, that is, anyone, male or female, who has a discharge, for the man who lies with the woman is unclean. And there you go. That is everything about everything you didn't want to know about.
Yeah. So again, these types of emissions are not in themselves sinful, right? Marital relations between the husband and wife is not sinful. Becoming unclean because of those marital relations is not sinful. The problem is when you take that uncleanness into and you breach sacred space. That's the problem. But becoming unclean because of this or that is not in itself intrinsically evil, or it's not intrinsically sinful, because that's you'll have various different issues. Maybe that's a pun intended. Just in life, right? Women
Right.
would naturally give childbirth. Your husband and wife would naturally have marital relations. It's not in itself sinful, and so the Torah isn't saying that those things are sinful or evil, but it is teaching the community to make a distinction between clean and unclean, and make sure you don't bring that uncleanness into sacred space. So basically, what it's doing is it's teaching you how to be a priest, how to make those types of distinctions, and so that's how you set yourself out from the nations around you. It's that you're making these types of distinctions, and just as how the Most High has made a distinction of the nation, you therefore are reflecting that in the types of distinctions that you are making. Um, and so within that, you've got all these various different ways in which to make these distinctions, which are being detailed here in Leviticus. So when it comes to eating holy things like the Passover in an unclean state. This is from 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verse 18 to 20. For many of the people, many from Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and Zebulun, had not been cleansed, but ate the Passover not as was written. But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, O good Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, atone for everyone who has prepared his heart to seek Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, God, the God of his fathers, yet not according to the cleansing of the sanctuary. And Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh listened to Hezekiah and healed the people. So there the text is saying flat out that the people are eating the Passover not as it was written. They were eating it in an unclean state. And so basically what this attests to is the idea of intention. Even though people would be breaching sacred protocol because you're eating the Passover in an unholy state. For instance, you could have come into contact with like corpses, for instance, and corpses would render you unclean, and therefore you wouldn't be able to eat the Passover. At least you could maybe eat the second Passover, but here Hezekiah is praying for the people, and the Most High sees their intention, and so now intention comes into the picture. It isn't just simply arbitrary. It's the Most High realizes that people wanted to observe the Passover, but he also realizes that they were in an unclean state and they weren't in a situation where they could get cleansed. And so being unclean wasn't the deciding factor in whether they could or could not eat the Passover, even though they were flat out contradicting the Torah. And so basically it goes back to the idea of intention. What was the intention of the people? And in that instance, the Most High heard them and he healed the people.
Okay. So
I do have. Go ahead.
just as we're doing this, I'm always just adding stuff into our the portions document. I'm saying like the intention was basically to seek God and fulfill His command, so their uncleanliness was not counted against them. Would that be a accurate description there?
Yeah, yeah. These types of things, the ancients very well knew about intention. When it comes to the offerings, for instance, they knew all about intention and things like this. The offerings aren't arbitrary. So when someone offers something, it's infused with intention. And when the Most High receives that, he sees the intention that's offered up with the offering. You will have writers like Philo or the rabbinic material, and they'll point this out. They'll flat out point this out. Without the proper intention of the offerings means absolutely nothing. And so, again, you get little elements of this in places like we've just read out here, but it's in other places as well, like in, off the top of my head, Psalms 51. In Psalms 51, basically you get the right protocol. It's get your intention right first, and then come and bring offerings. So they knew this, they understood this, and the same goes with ideas of cleanness and uncleanness.
I do have a question.
Sure.
So, when it comes to we're talking about like sacred space in the temple, why is something like sexual relations considered like an unclean act? So, like going back to the Garden of Eden, like that'd be another example of sacred space, if you will. And the text doesn't explicitly say anything, but my presupposition would be that Adam and Eve probably would have had relations in the garden. I could be wrong with that. But then also going to like the eternal state where things are made whole again, my understanding would probably be that mankind will still be procreating. And so, I don't know, I don't know. I'm just trying to think it through. So, is there any understanding as to why like sexual relations is considered something to be unclean, or the individual is unclean afterwards?
It's difficult to really pinpoint an answer for this. Some people would say, well, when you've got like an emission of semen, that's it can have an aspect of death associated with it. But here's the problem: the text doesn't say that. The text doesn't explicitly say that. And so it's very, very difficult to kind of pin down, why is that context a bad context, and why does that bring uncleanness? And I don't really have a kind of an answer, because I don't believe that anyone really, as far as I understand, there's no real clear-cut answer on this.
Sure. I was just curious.
Okay. Another question I found that was interesting, and kind of puts things into a slightly different perspective. But since a man and a wife become one, then is the man also then like anyone that obviously would share a bed with someone who is on their period or something like that, they would be seen as unclean. But if a man and woman who are married are they seen as unclean since they are one? Are they sharing that uncleanliness during that time, or are they seen as two separate entities and they are not? They're just one in purpose, but two different agents entirely.
No, they would both become if a husband and wife had marital relations, they would both become unclean. They'd both be seen as because yeah, they both become unclean, even if, sorry to get a bit technical, but
Yeah.
even like if the seed fell on the bed and things like this, it would be considered unclean. It would basically the whatever it falls on, it will be unclean. So that'd be inclusive of the woman. So
So
and there's other.
if a
I
woman's
won't
like having
go,
her
but
menstrual cycle, um, and being that the man is part of that, whether or not he is touching things that she's touching, are they just both considered unclean because they are one, or is that seen as like he can avoid from
no,
being
in
unclean?
that kind of context, the husband would yeah, the husband would need to touch something.
Okay.
The woman is either like sat on or things like this. Again, at least if you're going strictly by what definition of what the Torah is saying and the specific categories that it's listing, the husband would have to like touch basically.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yep.
So I'm just trying to think through this. Would it be standard during that period of time? Would people just have a house and also own a tent as well? So whenever they become unclean, they just dwell in that tent outside the camp, or how would that work?
I would imagine there was some kind of setup outside of the camp, kind of like a space that the Torah doesn't really specifically say,
Okay.
and so basically it's now what can we infer? Um, you know, they were going outside of the camp, but what were they doing outside? And I would imagine it would probably be probably like another like a sub camp basically, where they would have protection because obviously you're dealing with the ancient Near East, and especially it depends where your context is. If you're dealing with the wilderness, if you're talking about during the sojourn in the wilderness, obviously they would still need protection.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine that if they were outside of the camp, there was protections given to them, afforded to them outside of the camp, but the Torah does not explicitly say. So
Okay.
all you can do really is infer from what we know.
Were they still allowed to work during this period of time, like work in the fields or wherever it may be, or was that kind of forbidden from the standpoint of not to transfer uncleanness to items?
Again, it's a question of context. Where are we? Are we in the wilderness? Because if we're in the wilderness, then obviously, if you're dealing with like agriculture, then you wouldn't really be planting. You'd be on the move all the time, right? And so it'd be a very different setup to how later on when they inherit the promised land. And so if you're dealing with when they inherit the promised land, what do you do then? That's a different kettle of fish. So then it goes down to definitions of what do we mean by camp? Okay, how do we define camp now that we're now in a static location and we're no longer in the wilderness? And so basically, at least in the Second Temple period, camp was generally, and I'm speaking generally, there's going to be differences, but the term camp was generally applied to Jerusalem. And so basically, the area of Jerusalem that was considered to be you've got different, how to explain it? You've got different areas of sacred space within Jerusalem, kind of like, I want to say circles of holiness. And the closer you get to the temple, the more intense the holiness gets. And so basically, if you're outside of Jerusalem, you would have been considered outside of the camp. And so some of what you understand in Leviticus and things like this, you wouldn't have to worry about it if you wasn't within Jerusalem, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Because also on top of that, and here's another problem because we're dealing with, this is why context is really important. In the Second Temple period, you've still got people who are still in exile, okay? And so they're not in Jerusalem, they're not in the Promised Land, they're not in Israel. they're outside of Israel. They're in Rome. They're in other places. And so a lot of the commandments that you see employed in Leviticus that deal with unclean and clean, they would really be a non-issue. Like the agricultural rules, for instance, they wouldn't be observed outside of the land. That's only for inside of the land. If you're dealing with Second Temple period, obviously it completely depends on what period of time that you're talking about, because there's a different setup for each scenario, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
All right, and going into the next part here. Have to update my note real quick. Okay. And as I don't know if you have a different one, I've got 2 Kings 7:3 through 20.
Yep, that's it.
Lepers at the. Okay, cool. Now there were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate, and they said to one another, "Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, 'Let us enter the city,' the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians, and if they spare our lives, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die." So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and horses, and the sound of great armies, so that they said to one another, "Behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the king of the Hittites, and the kings of Egypt have come against us." Hold on just a second. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into the tent and ate and drank, and they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. Then they said to one another, "We are not doing right. This day is a good day of good news. If we are silent and wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." So they came and called the gatekeepers of the city and told them, "We came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no one to be seen or heard there, nothing but horses tied and the donkeys tied and the tents that as they were." Then the gatekeepers called out, and it was told within the king's household. And the king rose in the night and said to his servants, "I will tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking, 'When they come out of this city, we shall take them alive and get into the city.' And one of his servants said, 'Let some men take 5 of the remaining horses, seeing that those who are left here will fare like the whole multitude of Israel, who have already perished. Let us send and see.' So they took 2 horsemen, and the king sent them after the army of the Syrians, saying, 'Go and see.' So they went after them as far as the Jordan, and behold, all the way was littered with garments and equipment that the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gate so that he died, as the man of God had said when the king came down to him. For when the man of God had said to the king, 2 seahs of barley shall be sold for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel, about this time tomorrow in the gate of Samaria. The captain had answered the man of God, "If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could such a thing be?" And he said, "You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it." And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died. All right, that is the end of 2 Kings. Comments, questions, anything?
Well, I guess you got there an example of four lepers, right? They're banding together. And so they're obviously living in some kind of community with each other. And so you can use text like that to infer kind of, what did a person or what did people do if they were kind of sent outside of the camp. And in that situation, it turned out good because they were used for good, and notified the king. And voila. But those are my comments.
I think it's kind of interesting that it kind of comes down to the look, we're gonna either sit here and die or we can go in there and die. And if they spare our lives, we live. But if they kill us, we'll still die. Like they're just kind of like looking at it as we're gonna die anyway. Let's just do something.
It's good reasoning. It's good reasoning. It's good practical reasoning.
Right. So it's just the mentality there is very much, yeah, it doesn't seem to be something where they're very, I don't know, like just being banished or being cast out for being lepers. Uh, it's much more of a serious note that people are just like willing to essentially kill themselves for being labeled as a leper.
It's a bit like the reasoning that was given to Naaman by his servant, right? If the prophet had told you to do something grand or big, would you not have done it? How much more so something small? So it's that kind of practical kind of wisdom.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments, questions, observations? Moving into the next part. Mark 1:40 through 45. Okay. Jesus cleanses a leper, and a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for a proof to them." But he went out and began to freely talk about it, and spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and the people were coming to him from every quarter. And that's it. That's Mark. Which I think we also already touched a little bit on this, where Jesus was, as the Messiah, just touching a leper, and then the leper is being healed from this uncleanliness. There's also, and I need to actually keep these as notes. There is something that said that because it was something that could not be actually healed, like no one could heal this disease. It was said that only the Messiah, when the Messiah came, that he would be able to actually cure someone of this. Like if anyone was cured, it had to have been the Messiah. And so I don't know if that was the same thinking in the Second Temple period or not, but if it was, then a news of being healed from leprosy in a place where no one had been healed previously would have spread like wildfire, as it states, and people would have associated that with more of that messianic kind of a title.
I mean, if you think about the Gospel of Luke, right, chapter 4. In chapter 4, the Messiah is in at a synagogue, and he relates the story of Naaman as part of what he's saying. And so this would bring us ideas of lepers being healed. But he also brings in the story of the woman's son being raised from the dead, right? Elijah sent and he raises a woman's son from the dead. And later Elisha brings, or through Elisha, Naaman is healed. And so you've got these connections that are going on in the Gospel of Luke. And later on in the Gospel of Luke, you see that the Messiah connects himself to a series of signs, right? The lepers are healed, the blind see, the deaf hear. And it long puzzled me, why is he pointing to a leper as a sign that the Messianic age has dawned? Are you the coming one? That was a question by John the Immerser Baptist. And so he gives this kind of reply, that has a collection of signs attached to it. And it makes sense to me now why he's talking in terms of being a leper, at least within the Gospel of Gospel of Luke. It's because you've got a setup in Luke chapter 4, where he introduces the story of Elijah and Elisha. And one narrative has the idea of the raising up from the dead, and another narrative has the idea of lepers being healed, and he's combining that in his own ministry. And so basically, it just tallies up with the idea of pointing to stories like this and then associating it with his ministry. And so, within that context, you've got ideas of, like, for instance, how John the Baptist is associated with Elijah. So the Gospels seem to be picking up on this kind of like Kings and Chronicles kind of imagery, and then applying it to the life of the Messiah and demonstrating, well, these signs are indicators that the Messianic age has dawned. But just some further thoughts. When it comes to like transference of holiness, you've got text like Ezekiel, which I've just posted. I'll read it. So this is Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 19. And when they go forth into the outer court, even into the outer court to the people, they shall put off their garments in which they ministered and lay them in the chambers of the sanctuary. And they shall put on other garments, and they shall not sanctify the people with their garments. So there you got the idea of transference, sanctifying the people with their garments, right? If the people touch the garments, then they're going to be there's holiness transmitted to them. And so now the Messiah is dealing with aspects of uncleanness, and he's bringing holiness to that which has uncleanness. And so basically the Gospels are presenting the Messiah in a high priestly role. And in the Gospel of Mark, what you see is this kind of the three categories of impurity being reversed. And so when you look at Numbers chapter 5, verse 2, it details three kinds of impurity. So I'm just going to quickly read this. And Yod-Heh-Vav said to Moses, command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has a defiling skin disease, i.e. leprosy, or a discharge of any kind, or who is ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. So there you got three categories of impurity. And when you look at the Gospel of Mark, it follows this sequence of defiling skin disease, i.e. leprosy, a discharge of any kind, and raising someone from the dead. So you'll see that the Messiah in Mark chapter 1, verse 40 to 45, heals the leper. And then he heals a woman with a 12-year flow of menstrual blood in Mark chapter 5, verse 25 and 34. And then he raises a young girl from the dead in Mark chapter 5, verses 35 to 43. So that sequence actually mirrors the three categories that you see in the Numbers chapter 5, verse 2 of impurity. And so basically the Messiah is being presented in a high priestly aspect, and he's bringing holiness to that which is unclean. And so this may account for the kind of title that you see in Mark chapter 1 when he's called the Holy One of God. The Holy One of God is actually an Aaronic title. It's a high priestly title. It's used in places like in Psalms 106:16 and Numbers chapter 16:7 when talking about Aaron acting as high priest. And so within the context of Mark, in Mark chapter 1, he's given this title, Holy One of God. And then you see him in sequence deal with the 3 categories of impurity that you see in Numbers chapter 5. So again, it attests the idea of him bringing holiness to the community, and is elevating the status of the community and restoring them and bringing honor back to them. So anyway, those are my comments.
Good commentary. All right. Anything else? Any other comments, questions, anything related to any of this throughout the beginning all the way till now? Because we are going to end up closing this. That was the end of the portions. All right. That concludes our Bible study. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to stick around, ask questions, fellowship, play a game, and everyone else will catch next week. If you are in, or if you're on Twitch right now, you can type Discord in chat, and you'll get a link to our Discord channel, so you can join the voice conversation next time, and also ongoing Bible discussions just throughout the week, as well as making fun of Yellow and Naz. And then, if anyone is in Discord and wants to head over to the announcements channel, there is a portion survey. So if you want to fill that out, that would be awesome, and we can make these things better each week. And Naz is probably not going to sing any outro music once again and disappoint all of us. So
Wait, why not, Naz? Do it.
How about no?
I'm getting used to rejection. All right. You guys have fun. I am actually going to go get some dinner stuff ready. So I will talk to you guys later. Enjoy. God bless.